Welcome to the June 2022 episode of In Search of Civility. I'm Jeremy Field, and I'll be moderating today's discussion with my co-host, Kelly Packer. Before we introduce our guests, let me share you a bit of background on In Search of Civility. In the series, we have an innovative partnership between the Association of Idaho Cities and the Boise Metro Chamber. We started this series in January 2021 and remain committed to discussing the challenges facing our state and communities. In Search of Civility believes in the idea that truth exists and cannot be found without a sincere exchange of ideas. Civility in our discourse, we believe, is the necessary grease for advancement and preservation of relationships, institutions, and society. To agree, one must first disagree well. Listening actively to key stakeholders, giving your political opponents respect and the benefit of the doubt, empathy and sympathy for their motives. Ultimately, civility gives us the opportunity for our own ideas and notions to change, bringing improvements to our own lives and even society as a whole. We believe civil dialogue can affect great change, which is why we strive to help important conversations take place. These conversations are not possible, however, without the help of our sponsors. Thank you to our media partners, Idaho Ed News, the Idaho Statesman, the Idaho Press, and the Idaho Capital Sun that provide us with a platform and an audience with whom we can interact. Join us today, thank you so much to those special guests. Kelly, can you tell us a little bit more about our guests today? And guests, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
You bet. Thank you, Jeremy. We have three special guests today. First guest is Governor Butch Otter. The people of Idaho re-elected CL Butch Otter as their governor for a third term on November 4th, 2014. He was first elected governor of Idaho on November 7th, 2006, and then re-elected on November 2nd, 2010. He previously served 3 terms in Congress, representing Idaho's 1st District from 2001 through 2006. Governor Otter is a father of 4 and grandfather of 7, and he's married to the former Lori Easley of Kimberly. They live on their ranch near Star. Governor Otter was born in Caldwell, and he graduated from St. Teresa's Academy, which is now known as Bishop Kelly High School in Boise. He attended Boise Junior College, now Boise State University, and received a Bachelor of Arts degree in political science from the College of Idaho in 1967. He served honorably in the Idaho Army National Guard's 116th Armored Cavalry from 1968 to 1973, and later was awarded honorary doctorates from the University of the Philippines and the College of Idaho in Caldwell. Governor Otter's 30-year career in business included membership on the board of directors of the J.R. Simplot Company, and he also served as director of the Food Products Division, president of Simplot Livestock, and president of Simplot International. He retired in 1993. While he was elected to Congress, Governor Otter was serving his 4th term as Idaho's lieutenant governor. He served in that office longer than anyone in Idaho history. He previously represented the people of Canyon County in the Idaho House of Representatives for 2 terms from 1973 to 1976, was on the Idaho Republican Party Central Committee, and was chairman of the Canyon County Republican Party. Governor Otter is a member of the Roman Catholic Church, the National Rifle Association, the Maple Grove State Grange, the Idaho Cowboys Association, and the Idaho 4-H $1 Million Club. He is a Grand Slam member of Ducks Unlimited, a lifetime member of Safari Club International, was elected to the National Cowboy Hall of Fame Board of Directors in Oklahoma City in 1991, and is a lifetime member of American Legion Post 113 in Meridian. I would like to note that Governor Otter is having some technical difficulties. We've had him on and off a little bit here this morning, and I hope he's able to rejoin us. It looks like we lost him again, but hopefully we can get him back. Our second guest is Isaac Belden. Isaac Belden wears a lot of hats. In his personal life, he serves the 2 most important roles as a husband and a father. Professionally, he is a business owner, a nonprofit founder, and a veteran of the armed forces. A lot of post-9/11 veterans have a story of bravery behind their choice to enlist. Many of them signed the dotted line because they saw what happened in New York and wanted to play a role in making sure nothing like that ever happened again. His story is a bit different. He joined on March 13th, 2001, 6 months prior to the towers being hit. He was a 17-year-old kid with no idea what he wanted out of life, but he knew he didn't want to become his parents. His childhood was rough, and he believed that the military would break a cycle he saw at home. So he convinced, then it says in parentheses, tricked, his mom into signing a form to enter the military before his 18th birthday. He served as a 12B combat engineer in the Idaho Army National Guard for 12 years. It's something he carries as a point of pride. Many of his years were spent as a weekend warrior, but the effect of even those times created a profound change in his life. He learned to follow before learning to lead, which is something he hated in real time, but found it to be incredibly important in hindsight. He believes that if you don't know what it feels like to follow, you don't believe that you can ever really, he doesn't believe you can really ever effectively lead others. June of 2004 was the most influential time of his service. He set out on an 18-month journey in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom. He served with the bravest men and women he had ever met. Excuse me. He fought with, against, and supported the Iraqi people in hopes that they could create real and lasting change. They did this not only to defend our country, but to defend the Iraqi people who had no voice. He described it as the best and the worst of his life. This single experience has left scars, both physical and mental, that will never fully heal. It was also this experience and the struggles that came after that have made him the man he is today. And he is thankful for everything that time in the military brought into his life. His experiences and exit from the military eventually led to the world of entrepreneurship, which he started 2 businesses and tried to find ways to give back through those efforts. His journey eventually brought him to his present focus. In 2018, he launched a nonprofit called the Veteran Entrepreneur Alliance, VEA. The VEA is his passion and was born from the belief that veterans lose 2 things when they leave service. The first is a sense of purpose. For many, identity is thoroughly entangled with military service. When that time is over, vets can be left wondering who they will be without it. The second is a sense of connection and community. The people and structure vets had are suddenly gone, and it's on them to find their way. Entrepreneurship helped Isaac rediscover both purpose and community. He started the VEA as a way to provide access to the people and resources needed for his fellow veterans. To rediscover this as well. The VEA is a strong organization because of the people who have come together to continue to support those who have served us. And last but certainly not least is our third guest, Dr. Mark Macbeth. Dr. Mark K. Macbeth has been on faculty in the Department of Political Science at Idaho State University since January 1995. His research focuses on the narrative policy framework, environmental policy, public administration, and pedagogy. I hope I said that right, Dr. Macbeth. He is currently the chair of the department and directs the Master of Public Administration program. He teaches courses in public administration, U.S. politics, and teaching and learning. His research focuses on understanding the role of narratives in policy and political conflict, and he has conducted research on topics ranging from rural communities and economic development to bison and brucellosis management in Yellowstone National Park. He is giving me a workout with my tongue today. Conflict over wind energy, nuclear energy, health issues, as well as scholarship on teaching and learning. An edited book on the Narrative Policy Framework, NPF, Narratives and Policy Processes, Applications of the Narrative Policy Framework in Public Policy Analysis, co-edited with Michael D. Jones and Elizabeth A. Shanahan, is being published in summer of 2022 as an open access book from Montana State University Press. He is a co-author on the NPF chapter in the 5th edition of Sabatier and Weibel's theories of the policy process, appearing in 2022. I keep looking for his head nods and he hasn't failed me yet. He is also a co-author on a NPF chapter in Methods of the Policy Process, published in 2022. His most recent research has appeared in Review of Policy Research, Policy Studies Journal, World Affairs, Policy and Politics, Journal of Borderland Studies, Journal of Political Science Education, PS Political Science and Politics, Teaching Public Administration, and the Journal of Public Affairs Education. In his postdoctoral career, Mark has been a principal investigator or co-principal investigator on 23 grants and contracts. Mark is also a co-author with Randy S. Clemens of Public Policy Praxis, a case approach for understanding policy and analysis. 4th edition, Routledge 2020, a book that has been on the textbook market since July 2000 and is now in its 4th edition. In 2020, he was recognized as a distinguished researcher at ISU. In 2011 and 2015, he was recognized as an outstanding researcher at ISU. In 2005, he was recognized as a distinguished teacher at ISU and was recognized as a master teacher in 2001. As you can see, we have some phenomenal guests today, and I'm excited for our conversation. Thank you all for being with us. And again, as I mentioned, hopefully Governor Otter is able to rejoin us here soon. Jeremy, with that, I'll let you kick us off with our first question.
Yeah, this is perfect. So yeah, no worries. We're going to get Butch on there. The lovely Lori Otter is out of town, and she's his tech support. So we'll get him back soon. But first, thank you to Isaac and Governor Otter for your service to our country. July is kind of a special month of patriotism and the 4th of July, and we were really happy to have you both as guests to represent that notion. One of the stories that really was striking to me during that 4th of July weekend, and I saw it on several different news sites, was that according to the June Gallup poll, we're experiencing a record low in the U.S. The number of U.S. adults that say they are extremely or very proud to be an American. This is something the Gallup's been tracking since the question was first asked in the year 2001. Why do you think we're seeing this type of results? And maybe we can start with you, Isaac.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think it's no secret. There's a really deep divide in this country right now. Seems like every topic has some sort of fight behind it. It's almost like there's been this line drawn in the sand and the sides have been picked and you don't cross it, right? Like there are too many families that sit across the dinner table or sit across the table from each other at holidays and things like that have to avoid subjects just to kind of keep the peace and not create friction and anger, right? So in a lot of ways, I feel like a lot of Americans have become kind of disenchanted with the idea of what it is to be an American. And it's unfortunate, but in some ways, I believe that some of the things that are causing these issues are also some of the things that make America great. The fact that we're able to stand up for our viewpoints. In a long-winded way, I really just think that sometimes we get so wrapped up in the day-to-day and the ugliness of everything that we forget just how lucky we really are here.
Definitely. Mark, what were you thinking?
Yeah, so I think Isaac, that's a really good response. And so I'll just add a little bit to what Isaac said there in terms of some things we talk about in political science, the discipline of political science. So Robert Putnam wrote a really good book called Bowling Alone. And it's a book I know we talk about. Jeremy's taking classes from me, so he knows a little bit about that book. Mm-hmm. But Bowling Alone is basically Robert Putnam's argument of what he saw this happening about 22 years ago now when he wrote the first edition of that book. And so what Putnam argues is that the success of our democracy, going back, to the time of de Tocqueville, when de Tocqueville came to the United States, he was a Frenchman. He studied the United States democracy in the 1800s. Well, what Putnam goes back to is we always had this kind of civic engagement with each other. And Putnam calls that bridging social capital. So social capital is just our connections with each other. And bridging social capital is when we talk to people who are unlike us. They might be unlike us in many ways, including politically. And so what Putnam argues is that we have kind of lost reciprocity, because reciprocity is built through those bridging social capital connections. And why he calls his book Bowling Alone is because he talks about the impact of bowling leagues in small towns, right? I grew up in a small town, Rupert, Idaho. There were all these bowling leagues on, every night, but Friday night was a bowling league night. And the people came together in bowling leagues and, they'd throw, you'd be your turn, you'd throw a couple of bowling balls, but then you would sit around and you would talk about each issues, and you get to know each other. So what Putnam argues that we've lost some of those civic connections, that we're less engaged in our communities now. And he blames that partially on when he first wrote the book on television, but now I think it's blamed more a little bit on social media. And I think there's a good question, maybe we should talk a little bit today, is like, is social media really social, or is social media talking to people who are just like us? So I think just to add to what Isaac said is, I think we're losing those interconnections, those associations, people to people, that moderates our politics and allows us to disagree in positive ways. And so that I think that's just kind of a little addition to what Isaac had to say.
Yeah. Governor, we're so glad we got you back on board. I was just asking the group about a Gallup poll that came out during the 4th of July weekend. And it talked about how we were experiencing a record low in Americans that will identify as being extremely or very proud to be an American. And I was wanting to get your results of why you think we're seeing those type of results in society right now, and why some people are feeling less patriotic. And just want to get your thoughts on that.
You know, I in a way, I think a lot of it has to do with some of the policies of the present administration. They're disappointed in what's going on in some of the policies. And so therefore, you know, those that want open borders are not proud that we're trying to close them. Those that want closed borders are not proud that we do, that we don't close them. So, you know, I think a lot of it has to do with a lot of the present issues. I mean, you can't go to the grocery store and be proud of the fact that because of a lot of the spending, why all of a sudden we're seeing inflation that is dramatic, like most of us have never seen in our lives. And I'm 80 years old. And so I think it probably centers around issues. Obviously, there are those that are proud of America, and we ought to be celebrating those people rather than talking about all the ones that don't. And of course, it all depends upon how the question was asked. And so whenever somebody starts telling me about a poll, I say, well, how did you ask the question? Because I've been both the victim and the benefactor of the way questions are asked. But you know, there's no question that people are kind of disappointed in a lot of the things they see. They say, well, this is the government, and we, the people, should be are not proud of the fact that a lot of the things that our government's doing. Now, I don't know if any of that makes sense, but you know, all Tip O'Neill one time said all politics are local. Well, there are even more than that. All politics are personal. And as a result of that, if you're personally disappointed in something, why, then you're going to be disappointed in the whole lot.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good insight into polling. It is a snapshot. And it didn't help that weekend was the weekend where the Supreme Court came down with some really big decisions that a lot of people felt passionate about. And we have it over this framework of inflation that we've never seen before. So I think we had that as a snapshot in time. I think you were absolutely right that poll reflects.
The other thing, Jerry, is we seem to be appreciating the politics of hate. And, you know, I ran 25 elections against 49 opponents. I don't ever remember. I would call my opponents on their record, their voting record or their issues record. But as far as getting nasty and hating my opponent, I'm just not there. The reason I'm on this program is because of the guy that ran against me in my second term for governor was Keith Allred. He called me and wanted me to be part of it. And I said, you bet.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you very much, Governor.
You bet.
Thank you for being with us, Governor Otter. And as we mentioned before, we're going to have a few questions where we frame the rest of the show and some of our future discussions here today on some of the philosophies and teachings that Dr. McBeth has shared at ISU. And so if you don't mind, Dr. McBeth, we're going to lean on you pretty hard for the next couple of questions, and then we'll open it back up for the rest. And I appreciate your understanding with that. And so I'll just lead with this question. What can you tell us? I guess two questions here. What can you tell us about political polarization in the U.S., and what do the different studies actually tell us? What do they say?
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Kelly. So political polarization, you know, the definition of that is the vast and growing gap between liberals and conservatives and Republicans and Democrats, which we all see. We all sense that. And you know, there's three main studies and the studies are kind of different theories of what's going on. So Morris Fiorina at Stanford, he says that the data shows that polarization is actually occurring among political activists, not necessarily among the mass public. I think, and that's kind of interesting. That was the first kind of real study of polarization I read. And so his basic argument, if you're the mass public, you care about other things. You care about the price of food. You care about lots of different things. And you're not really necessarily polarized one way or another because of politics. Then there's Alan Abramowitz at Emory University. And his theory is called negative partisanship. And this is really interesting. His argument is not that individuals today like their party so much, it's the fact that they dislike the other party, right? It's negative partisanship, that they just dislike the other party so much. And I'll share some data from my introductory students in just a minute about negative partisanship. And then the third theory is Ileana Mason at University of Maryland. And I really, really like her work. She says that her studies at Maryland say that we actually agree, if you look at red and blue districts, Republican and blue congressional districts across the United States, there's wide-scale agreement on policy issues, on what government should or shouldn't do. Now, I believe if you want to look at some of that, I'll tell you, there were 266 questions where there was no statistical difference between red and blue differences. There were another 90 questions whether there was some difference in magnitude, but both sides kind of agreed on the issue. And then there are only 32 questions out of roughly 300, 400 questions where there was lots of disagreement. And those are, of course, those are wedge issues, and wedge issues can be used to separate people. So basically, Mason says this. I love this quote, right? She calls this affective polarization, which is, again, it's not really about the issues. It's about how we view our political identity and how we view others' political identity. So it's affective polarization based on emotion. And she says this, right? Basically, the United States is a nation that we may agree on many things, but we're bitterly divided nonetheless. That's a really good quote. Now, this is interesting from my class. This is a study I did with my Introduction to Politics class. And I'll just put in a plug here. ISU students are great. Idaho students are great. I love teaching ISU students, and I have faith in them. I'll probably talk about that later. But if you ask them, right, I did a study over about 4 semesters. And one question that often gets asked in these polls are, like, would you be okay if your child married someone of the opposite political party? So only 19% of students said that they would be unhappy if they had if a child married someone from the opposite political party. Okay. Now realize my students are 18 to 20 years old, so they're pretty young. They probably don't have kids yet. So this is hypothetical. But if you ask them, would you marry someone of the other political party? Right? It's about 69% of my students say, no, I would not marry someone of another political party. But right. But if you ask them, like, how should we make decisions in this country? Should Republicans get everything, Democrats get everything, or should we talk to each other? They'll say, oh, yes, we should talk to each other. We should, sometimes Democrats should win, sometimes Republicans should win, depends on the issue. So when it comes to policy, what government should or shouldn't do, they're pretty, yes, we should talk, we should have democracy. But when it comes to, like, would you marry someone of the opposite political party? They're like, oh, no, I wouldn't do that. That's very interesting.
That is interesting. I think that's really fun. And I am I think a former officially, but I'll always be a student of Dr. McBeth's and his research. I love my time at ISU as an MPA student. But Dr. McBeth, tell us a little bit more about a theory that, or actually a framework that you discussed. You and some of your students created what is called the narrative policy framework. And can you tell us a little bit more about the role that narratives play in political polarization?
Sure. And Governor Otter kind of led me here in his kind of the end of his comments there. So the narrative policy framework basically is just, we've seen in the United States and throughout the world, the influence of narrative, the influence of story in how people make decisions. And I think cognitive psychology actually shows us that is how that humans, we make sense of the world through stories. So we could just think about stories we knew as children, stories we remember our parents telling us, right? I always tell my students, my favorite story was the tortoise and the hare. And I've always seen myself, I'm the tortoise, right? And that story was always my favorite story. And that kind of shapes how I view myself, how I view colleagues, how I view lots of things. I like people who are tortoises, people who work hard and plug along instead of the hare who runs off and runs out of gas. So when it comes to politics, that is how we make sense of the world, is through these stories, right? So a story is, it has characters, it has hero, villains, and victims. It has a plot. It has a moral to the story. So the moral of the story of the tortoise and the hare was, work hard. Don't be a show off. Don't just plug along, work hard all the time. That's the moral of the story. So in politics, we have these narratives, and those narratives often divide us. Now you'll see later they also can bring us together. But as Governor Otter said, what our studies have shown, and we started by studying narratives in Greater Yellowstone. So that's the bison and brucellosis, snowmobiles, environmental issues in Greater Yellowstone. And what we found was that often both sides would portray themselves as losing. So the environmental side and the more ranching side, or the motorized recreation side, the environmental side, they were both using narratives that they were losing, which is fascinating, right? And their narratives were dominated by villains, right? The dominant character being villains, right? And the other side is turned into a villain. And so I always tell my students, think about if you're having a disagreement with your neighbor about a fence line, and it's your neighbor, and you have this good connections with your neighbor. Well, you're going to disagree about where the fence line should be. You're going to build a new fence, and there's some disagreement, but it's your neighbor. You're going to work out that disagreement. But if you villainize your neighbor, that's a whole different thing, right? That's what Governor Otter, I think, was talking about, right? When you villainize your neighbor, then it's going to be a lot harder, much more difficult to work out where you're going to put that fence line. Well, that's what I see happening in politics with narratives, is this huge increase, not necessarily just in narrative, but in these villain-based narratives, and the other side being a villain. And again, I try to teach my students, don't fall into this social media trap where we just villainize each other on social media. Look at the person across from you. This is that bridging social capital I talked about earlier. It's a person across from you. It's a human being. And you have to talk to that person and talk about where you agree and disagree about politics. But don't turn that person into a villain. So I think that is how narratives divide us, is because these villain-based narratives really, really divide us.
Well, remember that the tortoise has all that protection. He doesn't have to run.
That is true. That is true. That is a good point. I haven't thought of that, but that is true.
And Dr. McBeth, this has been fascinating to me as I've looked into this a little bit more since Jeremy introduced your name to me a few weeks ago. And it's so true, as I've watched now on social media, for example, or even in my own conversations with individuals. How are we portraying, right, our differences, and how are we portraying the people on the other side with those differences? And so to that point, and we're going to ask you, Dr. McBeth, and then we're going to open it up also to Isaac and Governor Otter. Can those narratives, is there a way then to use those narratives to reduce political polarization rather than, they've kind of, it seems like, been the catalyst for so long. Can they actually be used to actually reduce that polarization?
Yep. Yes. And I think what Jeremy is referring to, in our Masters of Public Administration program, my courses are all about practitioners. How do we bring people together so we can talk about issues rather than having this divisiveness? So I say narratives divide us, but they also can bring us together. So at ISU, my colleague Donna Leibecker, my political science colleague, and I have been working on, how can we use narratives to bring people together? And so Donna Leibecker, when she was in grad school and in her postdoc work, she was in Colorado. She grew up in Colorado. And she worked with ranching families about and talked about environmental concerns and how do you build bridges between ranching families and ranchers and environmentalists in Colorado. And so we've continued that work since she came here about how we break down barriers and we build these bridges again. And so we've studied recycling and we've studied river restoration. And so the best way I can summarize our findings comes from a practitioner, right? A person who worked for years in Idaho, worked for the state of Idaho, and worked with water and water pollution. And he says this, right? When he would deal with a community, a small community in Idaho, and he grew up in Idaho like I did, he would say, I don't ever try to pinpoint blame. Instead, I try to find how the river's problems are harming people, like kids cannot swim in the river because it's polluted. I look for solutions. I look for good people to champion those solutions. That's all a quote. So basically, that practitioner sums up our research, right? So we should not use villains, right? The problem in our current politics is we're always looking for blame. We're always looking for, instead of solutions and fighting heroes, we're fighting villains. So we should not use villains, right? We should use popular heroes. So when we're talking about river restoration, you're restoring the Portneuf River in Pocatello, throughout Pocatello, and even the upper reach up there toward McCammon, where Kelly grew up. You know, we want people to champion that who are ranchers, who are well-known community members, right? And talk about things they've done on their ranch property, for example, to improve the river, right? So use positive examples, right? And then I hate to use this term, but worthy victims. So that's like the kids can't swim in the river, right? So we don't create this villainized narrative. We try to create a narrative to show how a problem is impacting all of us, regardless of our political identity. And I think that's kind of one way that you try to use a narrative is you strip it of all the villainization, and then you go out and you find heroes, and those heroes, you find heroes from both sides who talk about the river or talk about recycling or talk about whatever issue is the focus of study.
No, I love the idea of making the sticky problem and the issue is what we're trying to confront, and we don't have to make it a personal attack or something that inherently divides us when we want to bring people together as a community to address these issues. And that's why I love your research so much and what you've done professionally to encourage those kinds of narratives and bring people together. So Dr. McBeth, thanks for setting the table for us.
What are your thoughts, Isaac?
Oh, what's that, Kelly?
We had mentioned that we were going to ask Isaac and Governor Otter.
Oh yeah, of course, yeah.
If they had some thoughts around that as well.
100%.
Well, and I would go back to what Governor Otter said in the beginning about hate and talking about his rivals and how, you know, he would call their record into question, right? But it's a whole different animal when you bring hate into the picture. It's okay to disagree. There's a huge divide between disagreement and hatred. And I think that's where we go from rivals to making your rival a villain. Is as soon as hate comes into the picture, there's no reason, right? You're going to disagree with everything that person says because they are the villain, not necessarily because what they're saying is right or wrong, or that you've done your research or your due diligence to make a rational decision. When you hate something, you're gonna hate it. And so I really loved the way he put it, in the way that he talked about, you know, through all of his time serving this country and serving the state, that there was never that hatred. And that he can still even get involved in things today with people that were his rival or his adversary in the past. So I think making the opposing party a villain, and then also making somebody on your side the hero, can be equally damaging.
Yeah, Dr. McBeth likes stories. And I'm going to tell you a quick story which I saw evolve. When I was elected to Congress, and I went back in 2001, why Jim McClure, the great senator from Idaho, who I had a great deal of respect for and who was always a gentleman, whether it was an adversary or not, he wasn't calling anybody any names or impugning their position. And so Jim and I went to dinner, and I said to him, I said, Senator, has it always been this vitriolic back here? Because I really thought it was bad when I got back there. It's nothing like it is now. And Jim's the senator told me, no, Butch, it wasn't. But let me tell you what happened. We are victims. Our whole political system and everything that happens here in D.C. is a victim of our great transportation system. When Louise and I were first elected in 1964, we came back to Congress. We only got to go home about 3 times a year. And we went home sometimes by train, sometimes by a slow plane. And so what we did was we stayed in town. And we would invite our fellow committee members, if we were on a committee together, over for a barbecue, and bring your kids, and our kids will play together. And so we got to know each other as people, as human beings, as the doctor said. And I look at today's situation and what has transpired in the last 21 years, and we don't talk. What we do is we put something on Facebook. We put something, we're not talking face to face, because there's things people say on Facebook they would no way say if they were in striking distance of you. And so what I'm saying is that we have to look at the consequences. Everybody wants success. Nobody studies what happens if we're successful with this high-tech communication that we've got now. And I apologize for being late, but you got to remember, 6 years in Congress, 12 years as governor. I had 18 years where somebody else was doing all the technology, not me. So I have trouble turning on my phone. But I would tell you the political leadership is a big part of the problem. And political leadership, I used to tell some of my colleagues, I'd say, well, you had a very bitter campaign. Those negative ads, and usually it's a third party running those negative ads. And I don't like those groups. I've been the victim of them. But I've also been unfortunately, the benefactor. But a leader needs to have a mandate. And I used to ask some of these guys when they had to vote on a real tough question, I would say, well, how do you feel voting on this real tough question that the only reason you're here voting on it is because you sufficiently made them hate your opponent? That's not a mandate. A mandate means that you got the issues, you said what you were going to do, you go back there and do it, or you go to your political forum, whatever you're elected to, and you do it. And you do it with confidence. And if you can't do it with confidence, then you don't have a mandate.
Sure.
Great
Thank
point.
you for that. No, I think that's really powerful. And I just see that all the time now. We have, especially just in the campaign world, it's about tearing down your opponent and making them be weird, out of touch, whatever it is. And you see that now, just at that national level, especially. It's pretty clear to see when you look at our politics in the way of narratives. It's hard to say that people have narratives or a mandate when they've really come into office by becoming less hated than the other person and not really having a clear mandate with their issues. So I really appreciate that insight. Thank you, Governor.
Well, and one other thing, and I think back to my time in the military. Starting out, right, you have leaders that you may think that you're smarter or stronger or better or whatever, right? But at the end of the day, they're your leaders for a reason. Like you're not going to defeat them by trying to exert your will over them. And sometimes just coming to the table and having a rational conversation where you give up a little bit of the ego, right? Give up a little bit of that, that overbearing like need to be right, and just say, hey, let's hear each other's sides, and let's try to come to some type of compromise. And I think that we're always gonna, well, maybe not always, but more often than not, we're gonna come out with something that resembles reasonable and a palatable compromise.
I like that, Isaac. You made me think about the reason why we put our kids in team sports, and we want to teach them to work as a team and be good to one another and be good teammates. And not everyone can be barking orders at the same time. And you made me think of that when you meet with your comments. So thank you for that. So now to kind of go back to our theme of the patriotism idea of our presentation here, is that with the 4th of July being so recent, we want to discuss the narratives around patriotic symbols a bit. Some Americans are taking these during athletic events, refusing to put their hands over their hearts during the Pledge of Allegiance, or taking other actions allowed by the First Amendment rights that they have that some find disrespectful or divisive in their portrayal. What are your thoughts about these displays, and how do you feel as leaders that we should respond as these, are elevated in our public discourse? Isaac, do you want to go first? I know it's a big question, but yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a complicated question, and it's one that it definitely carries a lot of anger behind it. Like I, for one, I stand for the flag. I place my hand over the heart for the pledge. I do those things because I do love this country. Are we perfect? Not by a long shot. But I love this country. I fought, I shed blood, sweat, tears for the country. I also do it because of, my brothers that I have lost that aren't here today. But then I also, part of what makes this country great is the fact that that Americans have the ability, and they feel safe enough to take a stand. Whether or not we agree with the way that they're doing it, they can do it without the fear that something terrible is going to happen to them.
They're not going to disappear.
And I'll relate it directly back to my time in Iraq. I was deployed in 2004, and I was there during the first election. And I see these people that took a stand for their country. They're showing off their thumbs because they had voted, and they're so happy and they're so proud of what they did because they believed that it was going to make real and lasting change. But simultaneously, the enemy was hunting down and killing those people and identifying them by that thumb, right? So while I get angry, I can't say that I never have. While I don't agree with the way that people show their distaste or their disagreement, I also appreciate the fact that they're able to do it, whether I like it or not.
Appreciate that. Governor, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, Isaac brings up a great dichotomy, I guess you might say, but it's a transition that I've seen happen, and I've really appreciated it. Isaac, I went into the military in 1967, and so I was part of the Vietnam era. And when I mustered out, I was at Fort Knox, Kentucky. I mustered out. I had to go to Washington, D.C. first, and then I came home, and I was D.C. to Chicago, Chicago to Denver, Denver to Boise. And as I walked through the airport, as you'll recall then, I don't know if you do today, but then in order to get the military rate on an airliner, you had to wear your Class A uniform. You couldn't go in fatigues like I see a lot of them getting on the airplane now, or you couldn't go in civilian clothes. You had to wear your Class A uniform in order to get those rates. And so I didn't get spit on, but I felt like I had, whether I was waiting in the airport at Reagan or National at that time, but in Washington, D.C., in Chicago, and in Denver. And it wasn't until I got home that I finally felt welcome. And so if Vietnam taught us, and that's a lesson that we should learn in our dialogue today. The only thing that Vietnam really, really taught us was how to treat your warriors, how to treat those people that we took pride in going and defending freedom, and we wanted freedom everywhere in the world for every human being, and that switch that I saw coming when we started celebrating our veterans, and we started, gosh, I watch all these programs on TV where we give disabled veterans homes, a great appreciation. Not a home loan. We give them a whole house, and so I think there's an opportunity for us to change the dialogue, and that's why when Keith asked me to choose a co-chairman, I chose Walt Minnick, because Walt was always reasonable. I don't know if you'll remember the campaign, but when Keith and I campaigned for the same office, we didn't campaign against each other. We campaigned for the same office, and we were always gentlemen. We never accused each other of doing anything or taking half truths and trying to make a negative ad out of it. And I saw Walt Minnick do the same thing. Now, he became the victim of a lot of negative stuff, but Walt's not bitter about it. He was disappointed that he only got to serve one term. And I met a lot of his friends back there. Dennis Kucinich. I don't know if you know anything about Dennis Kucinich, but there's not a bigger liberal in Congress than he. And Dennis and I didn't vote on anything the same, even if it was adjournment. We became very close friends. And in fact, one time I got on the elevator in the Longworth House office building. Dennis was on the 4th floor and I was on the 7th floor. And whenever we did say something that could be taken derogatory, we said it in a very comical way. And so Dennis was running for president for the Democrat nomination at that time. And we had become such close friends that we'd talk about this all the time. And anyway, so Dennis says to me in front of all these people on the elevator, he says, Otter, you radical right liberal conservative, if I get the nomination, I've been seriously considering asking you to run as my vice president. And I said, and Dennis was in the back, and Dennis was a short guy. And I said, I don't know who that is, but it sounds like Kucinich, that liberal puke. And by the way, Dennis, if that happens, the whole mystery of cold fusion is over. But that's the kind. He brought his bride up to meet me, not his bride at that time. 20 minutes later, he calls me back in the office, and he says, "Butch, do you think I ought to ask her to marry me?" I mean, that's the kind of, and I'm telling you, there was no more liberal person and no more conservative than I was. I mean, there was a lot of conservatives there, but there was nobody more conservative, I felt, than I was, and I followed my dictates.
Well, I love those stories, and I love Dennis Kucinich stories. So thanks for sharing that. That guy is an example for every man who's trying to marry up. So,
yeah, I told him, I said, Dennis, you marry this gal, you've outrun your punt coverage.
100%. 100%. Good for Dennis.
Yeah.
Dr. McBeth, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, these are great. Yeah. I had never thought, Governor Otter's point about how his story with Senator McClure, I had never thought about that, how senators and congresspersons travel more now back to their districts or states and don't get to know each other. I hadn't thought about that. That's very interesting. So when I think about this question, the patriotic symbols, when I was a young faculty member, Texas versus Johnson was a big issue. So Texas versus Johnson is the U.S. Supreme Court case that said burning the U.S. flag is protected speech. And boy, my students we used to have really, really good discussions and powerful discussions about that case. This is back in the in the 90s and early 2000s. And in that case, it's interesting because the two Supreme Court justices who really disagree are Anton Scalia who very conservative, and Scalia, he's writing to argue that someone should be allowed to burn the flag as expressive conduct under the First Amendment, and that only makes the flag more powerful, right? Because people want to burn it because it's such a powerful symbol of our country and those kind of things. But then William Rehnquist, Chief Justice, also a very well-known conservative justice, he argued on the other side and argued that when you burn a symbol, it loses its importance. He would talk about the power of Iwo Jima, that famous raising of the flag at Iwo Jima in World War II. And so I try to get my students to think about the importance of political tolerance, which is not that we have to agree that someone should burn the flag, but we want to give people rights, the same rights that we want to have. And I use a narrative of when there was a group of neo-Nazis who wanted to march in Skokie, Illinois, and they wanted to permit to march, right? And they were a group, anti-Jewish group. The person who defended their right to march was a Jewish attorney whose family had died in the Holocaust. And that's a wonderful story about how that attorney argues that in the United States, we have to have the ability to express our views. And we do not have to agree with those views, but we should give others the same rights that we want. And I think that idea of political tolerance is just so important. And I still argue that I'm never partisan in class. I think Jeremy would say that, but I do make arguments. And one of my arguments is, like, we want more speech, not less speech. And so if you're unhappy with someone's speech, then you have the right to go out there and have counter speech and try to say why the other side is wrong or why you disagree with the other side. But protect the other person's right to speak. I think that's a fundamental attribute of the United States. And I think we're losing some of that. I keep coming back to social media, and I think Governor Otter was coming back to some of that, like with the idea of social media. We're losing that idea of, we disagree, but I respect your right to speak. And I think in social media, because we're not seeing each other as human beings, we see each other as just people on a screen or as a name on a screen. We're losing that idea that we want to respect. I respect your right to speak and disagree with me. I think we're losing that. And social media actually rewards bad behavior, right? We all know, if we're in an organization, we want to get along with each other. So look at Governor Otter's great stories of when he was in Congress and Dennis Kucinich. I think that's a wonderful story. But on social media, right, we get rewarded for bad behavior. If I say something outrageous, I get a whole bunch of likes and it gets pushed up on the social media chain. It goes viral. If I say something like, well, I agree, I disagree with you, but I think you have a right to say it, I'm not rewarded. So social media rewards divisive narratives and divisive speech.
Thank you. This has been a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate all of you. We're starting to run out of time, so I'm going to ask our last question. We're going to miss a couple, and I'm really sad about that because I was looking forward to hearing what all of you had to say about those. But I think this last question is really important, and I think it goes hand in hand with all of the great comments that you've made, each of you. And it's really around, the responsibility that the public and their elected officials have a mutual responsibility to create this more welcoming atmosphere that we've talked about, where everyone feels safe in sharing their thoughts and ideas. So I'd like to have each of you take just a couple minutes and share how you feel we foster that actual type of environment. What does the public and the elected officials in our state and across our nation need to do to foster that type of environment? Governor Otter, do you want to go first, and then we'll go to Dr. McBeth and finish with.
Thank you, Kelly, for that. And it was good to see you the other day, by the way.
Yeah, that was fun.
You noticed when you were in the crosswalk, I didn't speed up.
I was grateful.
I tell you, the leadership needs anchors. You need to know that your leader is your leader. I said before, that they need to have a mandate. But people often ask me how I make decisions. And here's the process. I call it the 4 C's. And this is the process I go through. First off, can I live with this decision in my conscience? If I'm going to sign a bill as a governor, if I'm going to vote for a bill as a congressman or a state legislator, if I'm going to do something as lieutenant governor, can I live with this decision in my conscience? And if I can, and my conscience is simply made up of my Catholicism, my upbringing from being in a family of 11. So that's my conscience. That's the sum total of my conscience. The second thing is this constitutional? And there's a lot of things that people will say to me when I explain this process to them, that there's your conscience comes before your constitution. And I said, well, there's things that the Constitution will let you do that my conscience wouldn't. Do you know that Congress can print money? And that gets us into a lot of trouble. And there's other things. But anyway, so the Constitution is second, and the third is constituents. Is this right for the constituents? Is this what they want? And they said, well, why wouldn't you put the Constitution or the constituents up with the Constitution? I said, because there's a lot of times constituents want things that the Constitution doesn't allow. And so you've got to have I put the constituents in third place. And finally, and probably this is equally important, is you got to treat all these with compassion. Whether it's a citizen that comes before you and wants you to do something, even if you can't do it, you got to have compassion for what they want. Say, I understand what you want, but the Constitution simply won't let you do it. Or giving powers. I remember when we had the big debate on the USA Patriot Act. And I said, you can't give these powers just to your friends. When you vote on these powers, you're giving these powers to every president from now on. And think about the presidents that we've had in the past. So I think that's the best way that, Kelly, that I can explain where I come from and what I expect. And I expect political leadership to have an anchor that I can look at and count on, whether it's their customs, it's their faith, it's their conscience.
Thank you, Governor Otter, both for your service and for those great words. Dr. McBeth.
Yeah, so I think I would talk about empathy. I think it's really important that our leaders have empathy with others who are unlike them. And that's something I try to teach my students, and Jeremy knows that when we're involved in a really contentious issue, we'll try to see the world from the other person's view, try to understand what life experiences that person has that leads that person to have that view, and why that view is different than yours. And always give people the best of intentions, that we disagree, but it's not that we are trying to harm the other side and vice versa. And that if we actually have empathy with each other, we're going to do better as a society. And I really like the idea. I like Governor Otter's story again with Dennis Kucinich. That's just powerful for me. And I tell those stories to my students. I think of that idea of empathy all the time. And I have a photo that I show my students of Mike Simpson, Congressman Simpson, and the late Governor Cecil Andrus sitting on a porch together when they worked on the Boulder White Clouds initiative in central Idaho. And I think that's a good example how people who maybe don't have a lot in common can get together and have empathy and do good things for the state of Idaho and for our country. So empathy and showing that we can disagree with someone but still like someone as a person. We don't have to be villainized. We don't have to villainize each other. We don't have to be enemies.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. McBeth. And thanks for teaching this to our young adults. Really appreciate that. Isaac.
Well, and I think that Governor Otter and Dr. McBeth covered it pretty well. So I guess I'll more approach it from how do we make some of this happen? And I think really the key is in mobilizing one another. I think human nature a lot of times is to take the path of least resistance. And if you're not mobilized and you're not engaged in trying to make these changes happen, you're just going to kind of go with the flow, and you're probably still going to complain about it when it doesn't go your way. But if you don't get involved and if you don't try to be a part of the solution, then it's probably not going to shake out in your favor some of the time. So kind of putting each other kind of on the spot and mobilizing each other, whether you're public officials or you're an average Joe. Just get out there and do something and encourage others to do it too.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, all three of you. We couldn't have had a better show. Appreciate you, Isaac, and Professor McBeth and Governor Otter for joining us for this important discussion today. And to all of you who tuned in to watch, we'd also like to thank the Association of Idaho Cities and the Boise Metro Chamber and our media partners, Idaho Ed News, the Idaho Statesman, the Idaho Press, and Capital Sun. I'd also like to thank my co-host, Jeremy. We are very grateful for the time that was spent today on this important topic. We'll be back next month with another edition of In Search of Civility on August 15th. Stay tuned for details, and thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.